If 95% of happiness is connection, like what does it look like to redesign a K-12 experience around that insight? How are we helping people sort of value that? And it's like the question is not like, what are you going to do when you grow up? But it's like, what kind of connections and relationships and communities do you want to be a part of when you grow up, right?
What would change if we designed education, work, and city life around our need to belong? What if we treated neighborhood potlucks and school friendships as seriously as GDP or test scores? Seriously. Welcome to Pacific Time, the podcast where we explore West Coast challenges, opportunities, and the potential for independence. I'm your host, Greg Ammerfell. Today's guest is Aaron Hurst, a social entrepreneur and founder of the U.S. Chamber of Connection. Aaron believes we're not just facing a political crisis, but a crisis of connection. From alienated tech workers to isolated transplants, from transactional schools to transient cities, he argues we've built a society that strips out the very thing we crave: deep, durable human relationships. The West Coast bears responsibility for inventing and popularizing tools that have driven us apart: mobile phones, social media, even the streaming services that keep us home instead of heading to movie theaters. And the West Coast is also a victim of disconnection, given how hard we have to work to afford living here and how little time that leaves for being with friends and family. Over 10 years ago, Aaron started arguing for placing purpose at the center of our economy. I asked him to describe how this thinking has evolved in the face of distrust, burnout, and division. This sets up a conversation about redefining what matters and rebuilding a sense of civic togetherness, one hug, one block party, one question at a time.
I think when I wrote The Purpose Economy back in 2014, it was sort of at the tail end of the Obama administration. We saw this huge shift in workplace. We saw a huge shift in the economy more broadly. What really emerged several years later was just that purpose was also playing a different role, which is there are a lot of people who are not finding purpose and were looking for some way to sort of channel that anger and energy of not having purpose. Because we as a society had devalued the purpose of a lot of people in our towns and in our cities, and they were looking for an outlet for that. And it was turning into anger, because anger can also be a form of purpose. There's positive and negative purpose. So, and what we've seen a lot of is just a lot of people who've been disconnected and disenfranchised and devalued. And with that happening, they don't feel a sense of relevance, and it starts to lean into anger, which starts to lean into sort of broader changes politically. So a lot of what we're seeing right now in terms of polarization and division is a result of disconnection, but also the devaluing of the purpose of many people who don't live in Silicon Valley.
What are examples? What points to a lack of purpose and how that's shown up in our national politics and discussions?
Well, I think you just look at it, Greg, very simply in terms of in our schools, what we are prioritizing, what we're saying is a good career, what is a good living. In our economic policy, what we're considering sort of jobs of the future versus, jobs that we're calling defunct. And yet when we look at a lot of the places where, for example, there is strong MAGA energy, it's in areas where a lot of the jobs are not those jobs that are considered of high value. They're not considered the future. So therefore, people's livelihood, what they do, what they care about is being devalued, and they're wanting to fight for that because that's what gives them relevance. That's what gives them purpose. So they're looking for some vehicle to give them purpose, and it shifts from sort of day-to-day value creation in their community to political and about an us versus them mentality. So you sort of see that shift when we start to devalue that. And it's remarkable how our educational system, our media across the board has just put so much emphasis on this idea of how can everything be like Silicon Valley when that's not the reality of the diversity of a population. We can't have a country that's all of sort of one set of professional skills. We need that full spectrum to represent a full population. And when we don't have that, we disenfranchise and we convert people into dissidents and into agitators who are frustrated with the status quo.
So what's your vision for an economy or a society that is thoroughly imbued with purpose?
Well, I think it actually comes back to a lot of the work I'm doing now. When I was working with purpose in the US, but broadly, keep on coming back to the number one source of meaning in people's lives is connection and relationships. Harvard study found 95% of happiness is tied back to the quality of our relationships. So when I think about an economy that's focused on purpose, that's focused on people's well-being, it starts and to a large degree ends with connection and relationships. How are we designing work? How are we designing our lives? How are we designing school to optimize for relationships? Because that's what we as human beings need, but also it makes us not be assholes. When we actually have connection, when we feel that sense of security, we don't lash out, we don't act out. So as I think about it from an economic standpoint, it's about really thinking about how are we creating the incentives for those things to happen? How are we pushing education to create people who are able to have the skills and the ability to have connection? How are we pushing employers to design jobs that make connection a core part of that job? How are we helping people create the amount of time and space in their lives for connection instead of squeezing it out with work, especially with underpaid jobs that don't allow people to have the time to actually be social?
So paint a picture. What does a place look like? Maybe a city or a company that you've seen outside of Silicon Valley where connection and purpose are thriving.
I don't know that I've seen like a place where it's like perfectly thriving. I think it's something that as a society, I think we're just starting to really understand what's happening right now. What I have seen is a lot of the things in the past, honestly, when you were on a smaller scale, that used to be thriving around connection and purpose because there was much more of a value put on the diversity of people and the diversity of talent that they brought to the room. Whereas now it's sort of hyper specialized and high volume. That efficiency sort of tends to squeeze out purpose, tends to squeeze out connection. So I appreciate the spirit of what you're asking. I think sadly it's not something that we see a whole lot of. We've seen some interesting bright spots where companies are. Like there's one story, it was from a long time ago, but I just loved it. There was a company in Ohio. It was a manufacturing company, and they actually made it one of their KPIs was the divorce rate of their employees. Now, I'm not suggesting that that be something that every company adopts, but I think it's a provocative question about the realization that they know that when people are, happy at work and have work-life balance, like the stability that brings to their lives, and recognizing that suddenly they're seeing divorce rates, that's a canary in the coal mine, that something's wrong. So it's just a different kind of thinking. There's also a lot of companies now that are, I think, recognizing that one of the biggest predictors of productivity and retention is having a best friend at work. So looking at like how that's being invested in.
I was just going to raise that example. I know you're referring to a survey that Gallup has done for years about employee engagement. And one of the questions that they've kind of really honed in on over decades of doing this research is, do you have a best friend at work? And I know in workplaces where I've been, we've asked that question and it's really polarizing. People are almost offended to even be asked oftentimes because it feels like, well, that's social and this is work. And there's a resistance to, kind of seeing that social connection is actually not just valuable to the company, but valuable to the people that make up a company.
Well, it's also, I think people feel judged by the question at times too. But it's interesting. If you look at the research, a best friend takes about 200 hours to cultivate. So if you think about that, work is one of the few places where you actually get that much time with someone. So it's like, if you're not doing it there, where are you doing it? So there is, I think, a strong case to be made for that. I think especially once we get post-university, if we went that direction in our careers, like there aren't other structured places for connection in most people's lives. We're generally sort of just on our own. So the workplace is a great way to do that. I think that a lot of those relationships that you think are best friends at work, once you leave, it's sort of interesting to see how many of them actually, sustain after that.
Yeah, I've noticed the same thing with parents you spend time on sidelines with for years and years, and it's like the sports stop, and you kind of lose touch with those folks too.
Yeah, there's a great I don't know the exact wording of it, but I think there was an Aristotle framework about friendship where it talked about there's like friendships of convenience, which is just it's easy, you're sort of in each other's orbit. Work is often that way. There's friendships of shared passion, which is you have an activity that you love, but if you aren't doing that activity, that may not extend past that. Same thing with convenience. As soon as it's inconvenient, it goes away. And then there's friendship of virtue, where it's actually sort of a true connection between people that extends beyond activity, extends beyond the day-to-day. And I think it's possible within a workplace to develop to that point, but that's really where you'd have to get for that to be a sustainable relationship.
Thank you for bringing Aristotle to work and to the sidelines at sports games.
That's what I'm all about.
That's great. You're alluding to the work that you're up to now, Aaron. Could you describe the U.S. Chamber of Connection and what led you to this project?
Yeah, I can give you I have a long answer. I'll give you the shorter answer for now. Last year I turned 50, and I think like a lot of 50-year-old men sort of realized I had invested way too much in career and in family, but not in my broader sort of social community, especially as someone who's moved 12 times in my life. And I also at the same time saw that as I looked across the country, that with everything that's happening, everything tied back to a singular problem. It tied back to the challenge that we're increasingly disconnected and isolated, and that there's this growing division in our nation, and that this is literally killing us. Connection and purpose are the two biggest predictors of longevity. It is destroying our democracy. It's destroying our economy. It's destroying our way of life. And despite this being the number one issue in our nation, there was no systemic response to it. You had folks that were doing research, which is helpful. There's convenings. In a city like Seattle, you've got amazing organizations doing all kinds of community activities, apps doing all kinds of things, but no one owns it. No one's taking responsibility, and no one's really coordinating across cities to ensure that we're actually addressing this. Because the modern world, connection doesn't happen naturally. We have to figure out a way to build the systems. So started the U.S. Chamber of Connection with the vision that every city one day will have a chamber of connection that is responsible for being able to convene the leaders who are the advocates across sectors for connection, and to be able to create a pro-social narrative for their city that reinforces the behaviors that are needed for people to norm to pro-social behavior, that they will have certain key infrastructure in place. So, for example, we believe that every city should have a very intentional way of onboarding new residents. So if you move to a city like Seattle, you should not be on your own. And it should not just be your employer who's onboarding you to their company. You need to be onboarded in a way that is inclusive of and focused on connection and community, so that we make sure that not only are you thriving, but you're a donor, a volunteer, and a customer of small business locally, that you're voting, that you're engaged. We need that infrastructure in our cities and towns going forward. So looking at how do we build that? And then just looking at like more broadly, like where are there gaps in connection and community in a city? Let's identify them, and let's partner across sectors to figure out what the hell are we going to do about it, and not make it okay that people are on the sidelines. No one should be in that position, and it's our collective responsibility to help people do it, because we all got to come together to come together.
How's it going so far? And what's putting wind in your sails? But then what hurdles are you facing to spreading this work?
There's been a tremendous response in Seattle. So we're piloting in Seattle. Seattle has a antisocial sort of core narrative called the Seattle Freeze, which you're aware of. And what's interesting is that people norm to it. And as a result, 49% of people in Seattle say they don't want to talk to anyone they don't know. It sort of becomes part of the norm of their culture. So the first thing we've really been working on is how do we change the narrative and replace the Seattle Freeze with the Seattle Bear Hug. And we've got a mascot of a bear who's just been going around town, giving out hugs, sort of inspiring people to think it's possible to have a different narrative. Like we don't have to have an antisocial narrative. Let's have a narrative that we'd want our kids to have, that we'd want future generations to embrace. So that's been going incredibly well. There's been a tremendous amount of press coverage. It's captured the imagination of a lot of people of what's possible. It's had cities across the country like wondering, what's the mascot? What's the pro-social story for my city, which is really inspiring. We've been able to bring together a Seattle Welcome Committee of 45 leaders across sectors who've really been the front lines of advancing and advocating for the city to become the most welcoming city in the country. And then we've been doing Seattle Welcome Day every month. Our fourth one's coming up in a week. These are 4-hour workshops where newcomers come together in a room, and we lead them through an exercise of designing the life they want to create here in Seattle, that's relationship forward, that's community forward. And then actually, instead of saying, here's a list of ways to solve for it, we help them help each other, because we know that they all are looking for connection. So why not actually help each other achieve it? So really empowering them to start to work together. And then we're experimenting with things after that. So we're starting to do some coffee matching based on shared interests, so helping people meet who have shared interests. We're starting to do groups of 8 to 15 people who share a common interest, meeting once a month to do an activity around that shared interest, because the research shows that's about the right size group to build connection. And you need about 6 touch points to really feel like a community. So how do we start to build that in? And then starting to work with the city to really think about how do we build this into the neighborhood strategy? How do we build it into economic development strategy, the park strategy, so that it becomes sort of fully entrenched in the culture of the region? So we have barely put our tiny little pinky toe in the water, but the pinky toe is feeling great in the water. It feels like there's great response to it. It's captured, I think, the imagination and hope of people. And I think at a time right now where politically there hasn't been a positive message to share, there's been sort of a dominant political message of the dominant party right now, and then an anti-message, but there's not been a vision of the future that gets people sort of rallied behind of saying, what could America be? And an America focused on interdependence instead of independence, to me, is a very exciting and hopeful message. And it's something that people want in their own lives, is that sense of connection and community. And it's hyper local, which I think the other thing that we're seeing more broadly nationally is this focus on localism. And connection is really at the heart of what localism is all about. So, we're hopeful that this is really sparking a movement that will change the culture of the country to be pro-social and pro-interdependence as we look at our next 250 years as a nation, as we enter that milestone of our first 250 next year.
We'll be right back. This episode of Pacific Time is brought to you by Share It Music, the nonprofit label that believes your favorite song can also be your favorite cause. Every time you stream or share their music, you're helping fund social impact projects. That's right, independent bands, podcasts about independence, supporting important causes. Sweet music, right? That's what we're going for with Indie for Indie. And if you haven't heard Share It band Instant Crush, stop what you're doing, well, right after this episode, and go listen. Their new album, I'm Sorry I Didn't Bite My Tongue, is out now on all the streaming platforms, and it has the contagious, unapologetically pop feel of an album you're going to be listening to on repeat all summer, in the car with the windows rolled down, or maybe at the late night rooftop dance party. It's fun and smart, and they make me think of The Killers and Dua Lipa. So if you've ever wished your playlist could do a little more good in the world, check out Instant Crush and the cause they support, Joyful Heart Foundation. See the show notes for links and listen to the end of this episode to hear the Instant Crush single Apology Tour. For that, and for all my future dad jokes, I'm sorry not sorry. Now back to the show. You're hitting on some themes that have been coming up a lot over the course of this podcast, that of independence and interdependence. What do you make of this notion at the heart of this show that the West Coast ought to explore independence, if not autonomy?
It's interesting. I mean, my daughter is in college on the East Coast, so it's sort of like, oh, so she'd be in school abroad, I guess, under that scenario. And I've got family all over the country, so it's hard to think that way just from the standpoint of identity and social construct. I understand sort of the spirit behind it. Honestly, when I look at the West Coast, I see tremendous hope, but I see a lot of really big problems. I mean, we live in Washington State. It has the most regressive tax policy in the nation. Like the state has the worst tax policy from a regressive standpoint, which has led to a lot of the problems in the state. I look at our school system in Washington State, and the unions have basically just put it completely frozen, and it's unable to really move forward and reinvent itself to meet the needs of the next generation. It's bifurcated into sort of independent and public schools. We've got incredible challenges with mental health issues in the state. So there's a lot I love about Washington, but there's also an awful lot of challenges that we need to address that other states, frankly, have done a better job of addressing in some cases. I used to live in California. Back in the day, they passed a ballot measure that froze taxes on real estate, and their sort of overall school system and economic system has been completely held back, I believe, by that policy. So there are some major issues, I think, in the West Coast as well, like tied to that around ballot propositions. Other states have that, but the West Coast is like big on people throwing out ballot measures to create change. And I'm not honestly a believer in that model. I think it is highly problematic because special interests get a hold of that and start passing things that are poorly worded that make people think they're voting for one thing and they're voting for something else. And then the professionals that are working in government, who are working as public servants, aren't respected to do their job because we're constantly giving them mandates that don't often make any sense and contradict each other. And we end up with just this like mess of a governing system. So it's not to say it's like great anywhere. I just am careful not to like overly romanticize what's happening on the West Coast. That said, I think there's obviously a lot that we do very well here and a lot more forward-looking vision around the environment and around sort of some of the key social issues. But I really was inspired by the Ezra Klein's book, Abundance. And I think the West Coast is absolutely like the poster child for dysfunctional ability to get things done from a civic standpoint, even with the best of intentions. And you see that in Seattle, just a long-winded answer here. But one of the things that's interesting in Seattle is it has some of the highest rates of intention of inclusion and some of the lowest rates of actual inclusion. And I think that's very indicative of the West Coast in general, which is it talks a big game, but it usually can't execute on that game. And the question to me would be like, how could we actually make the West Coast more effective, actually walking the talk? A great example in Seattle. Seattle prides itself on being this wonderful, inclusive place. But if you're a newcomer to Seattle, like this is not an inclusive place. at all. It's not a welcoming place to date. It is not a place where people are respected and seen as humans, regardless of where they work or what their background is. It is highly bifurcated, highly divided, and we like to just continue to pretend we're this like progressive bubble case study, but we're actually not really living that vision. And I think that's why the mayor here is, I think, doing a fantastic job, at least starting to really make the case of one Seattle. We need to come together and say, what do we all have in common? What is our shared destiny? What is our shared humanity? And the connection's at the core of that. And we've been really delighted to have his support of our work around connection and welcoming newcomers and saying, you're a Seattleite the second you arrive here. You don't have to wait 30 years. Being a Seattleite is a respect for each other. It's respect for a certain set of values, but it's a belief in a future that we can build together.
Well, let me circle back. I mean, obviously, the idea of West Coast independence is a disruptive political possibility, but the playful part of this is a more speculative question, which is, what if the West Coast could start from scratch? So, Aaron, what would you focus in on? What would you want to see the West Coast get in place if we had a blank slate?
So connection obviously is my bias, and really thinking about how do we use that almost as like a constitutional, like a state constitutional framework for connection as something that we are factoring into every decision that we're making. I think the environment would be a key piece of any framework and how we're thinking about the actual true economic cost of goods and services. I think our economy and the way in which we're structured is that the companies that sell things are not responsible for the long-term effects of their products and services. And that's just creates a lot of perversion in the system. That goes from like a waste point of view, but it also goes from an addiction standpoint. If your product is addictive, it needs to be heavily regulated, whether that's social media or sugar. That needs regulation because companies have the budgets and science to manipulate us out of free will. And when you get rid of free will, to think that we have free markets is a silly story. It's just absolutely not the case. So we'd really look at like addiction and the role of addiction and how we truly address oversight of that. And then education, I mean, it's cliche, but true. Like the children are the future. And how are we we'd have to restart our schools, I believe, and really rethink a people forward version of schools. It's also not just parochial. I think so much of the movement right now is around skills and preparing for the workplace. And if 95% of happiness is tied to connection and human relationships, we should put that as the top priority, not skills that, frankly, in the world of advancing technology, change every year. What's needed? Let's put emphasis on the things that are what make us human and refocus the educational system on that and excellence around that. So that's where I would start.
I love the idea of weaving social connection into our kind of first principles. What would that look like if there was a West Coast Constitution?
I don't know what the exact wording for it is because this is I have never thought of this as an actual possibility, so haven't like started drafting what that statement would be. But I think about it in terms of our Constitution around sort of what are inalienable rights and like how do we think about what's truly a value. Connection and community, I believe, should be things that are enshrined at that level of importance. And things that fundamentally erode value in that area there should be some form of oversight or at least intentionality around them.
Well, and it strikes me, part of what I'm wondering about the West Coast is, do we need to become, a sanctuary for the best values of American democracy? And so as I think about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I think you might be saying, well, gosh, we sure know a lot more about what goes into happiness, and it's very social. How do we build that into our not just our Bill of Rights, but the sort of strong incentives that the government gives in order to create a sustainable society?
I think that's absolutely right. And then I would also add one of the things I've seen across the country in I think the progressive movement and in philanthropy has been unintentionally being divisive by focusing on very targeted needs of those who are often in most need, which just totally makes sense. And you can see why it's gone down that path. What we've moved away from is the common good. And I think that's a lot of why we've seen division over the last decade or two is that we've stopped investing in common good and we've started bifurcating these two different populations and having different bodies serve them. So school system is a great example where, independent schools, public schools, like the kids don't, like there's very little intersection. So then when they graduate, you further sort of separate people out. We're not designing our schools. We're not designing so much of what's going on in our cities around common good. We're very focused just on specific niche populations. So it'd also be interesting to really think about what does common good mean? And how do we really make sure that we're not valuing any life over another? And that doesn't just mean not devaluing those who have less means, but it actually means honoring as well those who do have means also need connection. They also need a lot of the things. And if that's what brings us together, instead of trying to find all the things that bring us apart.
So what makes the West Coast uniquely suited or uniquely challenged when it comes to building connection?
I think we just talked to one of the biggest pieces. It just has so many transplants.
Mm.
With so many transplants, they're coming and just struggling to find connection. It just takes a long time to do that. And then you also create the friction then with them and the people who have been living there, because it's creating the price increases in properties, which is causing people to not be able to stay where they actually were raised. So you're sort of doing both things in one foul swoop. You're like dislocating, and then that's by definition then dislocating the people who actually have roots in a place. So I think that's a really big part of it. I think the West Coast tends to also be very tech dominated in a lot of places, and the work-life balance in the tech industry is not great. Focus on connection in that industry is not great. So that's been another major variable. It's interesting. Seattle does have so many of the like third places. It has so many of the different things that you would think would be helpful. The educational system is not teaching people how to have relationships. And I don't think that that's necessarily a West Coast thing, but it's a big part of where the challenge is. I was with a bunch of parents last night, and we're just talking about how one of them was saying they had to send their kid away for like an intensive in California on how to have a relationship. And I don't mean a romantic relationship, but just like straight up how to interact with people, because especially with the pandemic, that was like largely lost. So, but I think the dislocation and the sort of overwork and the displacement, those are really some of the biggest factors that I see.
Do you look at cities up and down the West Coast, or and maybe not just cities, suburbs and rural areas too, and say, here are their kind of assets in terms of connection? What would you highlight if you've had that look?
I mean, it seems to be places where there's a university that's sort of at the core of like a mid-sized city. Like there's a lot more intentionality that I've seen sort of around building community and the role that plays. The sprawl in the suburbs is, been shown historically to be highly problematic in terms of people actually like intersecting and connecting. So you see, I mean, we're the kings of sprawl when it comes to the U.S. in terms of just building out sprawl. In terms of places, like there aren't like major places that I feel like have gotten this right yet. I think it's most of the small towns sort of hear stories about doing it. We're just at this point of dislocation, especially with tech right now. People are just so addicted to their phones and addicted to technology that you're seeing pretty universally that's not working. What I see more are bright spots of blocks. Like there are blocks in Seattle where people are like, this is the best place ever to live because they've got potlucks, they've got a block party. Like a lot of them just sort of leave their doors open and like the kids are interacting. You see like there's a couple of key leaders on that block who are the advocates. We've got this amazing neighbor here, Audrey. She hosts a birthday party every month for all the kids in the neighborhood who had a birthday that month. She's constantly putting together activities and events, and it changes the nature of that neighborhood, right? So I see bright spots more at that level, sort of street by street, block by block, than I do at a city or town level.
Well, I'm so glad to hear about someone like Audrey, because it feels like we don't celebrate local level leaders exactly like her. Every block needs that, and for every block to have that, we need to know about what it's like on the rest of the blocks, right?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things we're looking at and talking to companies about is how could we actually turn that kind of role into one of the volunteer roles the corporation includes in their corporate volunteering. So imagine if, you're at a company and you're looking at volunteer opportunities through the company and they're like, well, rather than having you go work at a food bank, which awesome, do that. What if you put together a block party for your block? Like, what if you threw birthday parties for all the kids in your neighborhood? What if you hosted potlucks? Like, can't that be a form of service that we celebrate and that we sort of count, if you will, in the world in which we try to count everything that is of value versus it just sort of going unnoticed and silent? And then, equip people to do that. Like if I'm an employee at a company and I want to do a block party, help me figure out how to get the permit. Help me figure out what makes for a great block party. Like we could scale that tremendously if we could make that a core part of corporate volunteering.
Interesting. I think what you're hinting at is, I mean, the sort of backdrop for all the work that you're doing with the U.S. Chamber of Connection is the loneliness pandemic. And yet we've seen people write recently that the loneliness pandemic has been overstated, that we have never had such amazing amount of connection, whether it's offline or online. Therefore, something else is amiss. What do you say to that argument?
I mean, it's good clickbait, so I think totally understand why it's written. Especially when you see like a rise of a topic, there's always going to be people who are going to be able to get clicks by sort of making the case counter to it. I find it really hard to buy that argument, just seeing what's happening with online and like what the role is. I mean, Jonathan Haidt's work around what technology is doing to the next generation and with connection is like so very clear. When I think about, Zuckerberg's recent sort of interview, sort of alluded to the fact that we can replace friends with AI agents, which I think is something that's going to start happening. I think AI agents are going to be to social relationships what porn has been to romantic relationships, where it's just going to completely disrupt people's expectations and what they're sort of actually seeking in human beings. That's starting to happen. I'm already hearing stories about that. When you've got a chatbot that's like much friendlier and more affirming than your friends, then it's pretty damn attractive to go into that vortex. I also think some of the argument that is valid, and the article in The Atlantic, Shasta Nelson, who's our chief friendship officer at the U.S. Chamber of Connection, was quoted several times in that piece. And her point more is like, we have a lot of superficial connection. We don't have like the depth. And her framework is we need positive, consistent, vulnerable relationships. So positive doesn't mean that you don't share like your deep concerns, but it's like you always find a way to move towards helping each other move forward. Consistent, we need to have 2 or 3 meaningful interactions with friends or family on a weekly basis. And most people are not doing that. 42% of people in Seattle, for example, don't have at least one of those a week. And then vulnerable, which is just being real and being able to have like an honest conversation with someone about what's going on with you. So when I see sort of the critique, I think the critique that is real is like we're very like is like broad without depth. And that's because people don't have the skills. They don't know how to do that. We need to help them sort of make that possible. We need to create space in their lives for that. But the idea that we aren't like facing a epidemic around loneliness, especially when I look at like what's happening with young men and how that is like converting behavior into some things that are very, very toxic in our society. When I see, how many people just are not even leaving their homes, that's got me deeply concerned. I just think it's unfortunate. I think the real, like it's hiding the real story there, which is just lack of depth, not that there's not a problem with loneliness.
So I'm sitting here thinking about, well, what is the force of change here? I mean, we can talk a lot about government's role in solving problems. We could talk about the role in the commercial sector's, opportunity, but also its contributions to the problem. It used to be, my sense is that organized religion played a vital role in creating social connection, and that's really been minimized. Obviously you're creating the U.S. Chamber of Connection as one kind of institutional approach, but are there other institutions that could step in and go after those 3 pillars of creating meaningful friendships?
Well, I think it just starts, as we talked about earlier, in the educational system. If 95% of happiness is connection, like what does it look like to redesign a K-12 experience around that insight? How are we helping people sort of value that? And it's like, the question is not like, what are you going to do when you grow up? But it's like, what kind of connections and relationships and communities do you want to be a part of when you grow up, right? Just sort of shifting that narrative to what actually matters most, which is not to say that it doesn't matter, but right now we only talk about that. So how do we shift that dialogue in the schools and really think about the skill sets that are needed? I think the other piece we're seeing is that most people don't even know what it means to have connection in their life. I give the parallel, which is not quite right, but just we know we need food. And we as a society have like normed on breakfast, lunch, and dinner as a model for how do we do that. Not that we all follow that, but that's sort of generally the norms. With connection, there isn't really like a norm around what does healthy connection mean. So that's a lot of the work we've done at the U.S. Chamber of Connection is we've identified these 6 points of connection that people need to thrive, but also that enables them to be part of a thriving community, because that's what makes that sustainable. So we really believe, whether it's, K-12, higher ed, employers, government, that we really need to look at these 6 points of connection and help people be educated about those needs, and then figure out ways to on-ramp and support people in those points of connection.
Aaron, are there business leaders or public officials you've seen model a more connected, emotionally intelligent form of leadership?
I don't know that I have like specific names that I'd want to name. I find it's challenging because I rarely get the full exposure to what they're doing and the environment in which they are. One person I've been very impressed with is Todd Lewicki, who is the head of the Seattle Kraken and the Climate Pledge Arena. And Went on a trip with him last summer and saw sort of how he interacted with the world. And I've been able to have the honor of, getting to know quite a few people on his team, and just the authenticity in which he brings to relationships, the investment in community. I have seen very few leaders that, at least with like what vantage point I've seen, have been so compelling and inspiring that way. So he does come to mind just because I feel like I've seen him from a couple different angles. I don't feel like I know politicians and most CEOs well enough to sort of understand what's real and what's presented. We do so much spin, so it's hard for me just to point to somebody.
I love that example, and also I love the idea of bringing this into the kind of realm of sports. I mean, I feel like in many ways, sports, whether at the professional level, college level, or below, have become social organizing principles. In some ways, I find that really problematic. It's like our politics shouldn't look like rooting for the Chicago Bears. It should be more meaningful than that. But on another level, this idea of fandom is a powerful way to organize groups of people around a common interest. What do you think are the lessons we can draw, good ones, that we can draw from the way sports works and the way sports teams operate to connect with fans?
Well, they create a shared purpose, I think, at the core of it. But I think there's two different elements to that. There's the like shared fandom, and then there's, I think, ritual. So regardless of like who your teams are, what sports, I've always been envious. I've never really had this in my life. It's starting to develop a little bit now, but just the group of folks that get together to watch, we'll call it the Sunday game, or the Saturday game, where it's not even about the game. It's just the fact that it creates a social excuse to get together, because it's hard to just say, hey, like, let's get a bunch of guys to come over Saturday morning. And they're like, well, like we could do it next weekend or maybe the next one, or like, what are we going to do? And people are kind of like weird about it. But if you're like, I went to Michigan, I invite a bunch of other Wolverines over on a Saturday morning to watch a Michigan game. Clear purpose. There's no awkwardness about that. There's nothing other than like, damn straight we'll be there. Let's go watch our team. And there's very few, if anything else, that has that kind of like very specific time, because now you can stream everything, but sports is at a very specific time, and it's a ritual, and it enables you to sort of come together and have a space and a container for connection. And I find that that's really missing in a lot of people's lives, that ability to do that. There's a lot of people working on one-on-one relationship where you get together. Like I got together with a friend, I'm about to go for a walk with a friend, but like actually being able to bring a group of people together on a consistent basis, sports is one of the few ways I've seen people do that outside of family get-togethers. So I think that's incredibly powerful, and then it's just consistent. I think sporting events themselves can be. I think it's a question of whether or not you're sort of seeing similar people. There is this sense, and Brene Brown did a great piece on it, just talking about like the synchronicity being in the stadium with that many people all aligned with something, like what that does as a sort of high is pretty remarkable. Feeling like you belong in that moment, like you're all here for the same thing. It doesn't matter what your background is. I think that's a very powerful message as well. And I love that. I'm a Yankees fan. I go out to games in New York regularly and sit out in the bleachers, and the people I'm cheering with are like, I consider them brothers. And if I ever talked about anything other than the Yankees, I would not agree with them on anything. But just sort of being there, like it just doesn't matter. Like everything else melts away.
Yeah, that's really powerful. You use the word belonging. What are the signs of us getting it right with belonging in American society and on the West Coast? What are the signs that we're really going astray?
So first of all, I do use the word, even though I struggle with it. I think it tends to be a progressive word that sort of makes people think about sort of it being almost political. I also think it tends to be more easily embraced by women than men in general. Men don't generally talk about wanting belonging. So a lot of the language, a lot of the work around connection has been put in a more female biased narrative. And that's fine. I just think that I wish there was other language we could use that could really inspire sort of both genders equally around it. But that's not your question. Your question is like, what do we know if it's working or not working? And the things I think about is like whether or not people are finding shared purpose across boundaries. So there's a form of belonging, which is just I'm around people that are just like me. So you see, for example, in Seattle area, there's a large diaspora from Pakistan and India, which is phenomenal. And you find within those communities, there's often a strong sense of belonging among themselves. So they embrace immigrants who come in, they create community around it. They're recreating a lot of the cultural rituals from India and Pakistan, but it's often not then integrating with the rest of the community. So there's like a micro belonging, but there's not a macro belonging of feeling like you're connected across these identities into a sense of civic connection as a city and a connection to the shared success of the region. So I feel like that's like a step one level belonging is that we'll call sort of shared identity belonging. I think the one that we need to, and you need that because that's what creates safety. But the true belonging we need to get to is the bridging belonging where you're able to find shared purpose with people who have dramatically different life experience than you, but you both have something or things that you care about, whether that's a sports team, whether that's about a cause, whether that's about a hobby, that we start to create that where people feel like they have community outside of just their immediate identity.
Well, and I think what I hear you saying throughout this conversation is we sort of take belonging and connection for granted in places where it exists, but don't necessarily believe that it can be cultivated and built. And I think you're saying, hey, actually, we know quite a lot about how this can be formed, and we can operate block by block or city by city or company by company or state by state at trying to bring this about. Is that fair?
No, I think that's right. And I think there's a couple of paradigms there. I think there's the paradigm I think our beloved president would use, which is like there's winners and losers, and connections just winners do it and losers don't. And like that's just the way it is. And you can't mess with that, which is obviously a wildly flawed perspective. But I think that's a pretty dominant point of view in our society, just around certain people get connection, other people don't. I think there's another one, which is what I'm starting to call social libertarianism, which is this sort of this belief, like if you think about economic libertarianism, it's kind of just like let things work the way they're meant to work and don't mess with them. And there's this idea, I think, of social libertarianism, which is just communities, just leave them alone to like create organic, authentic connection themselves. And just like with economic libertarian, there's great success stories that come of that, but most of the stories are about things not going the way they need to. And that's why I think we really need a different frame when we talk about this. That's really about like a civic connectivism, where we really think about the fact like we need to take collective ownership of the need for connection and not to sort of leave it to chance. It's just too important.
Aaron Hurst gave us a vision of a society rebuilt from the sidewalk up. What if we stopped asking kids what job they want and started asking what kind of community they want to belong to? What if connection wasn't a soft skill, but civic infrastructure? What if the metric of a thriving society was not GDP, but depth of friendship? That's what Aaron's building, and maybe you are too. Got an Audrey on your block? Planning a potluck this month? Tell us on Substack, Instagram, or wherever you show up for your community. And hey, share this episode with someone you're overdue for a meaningful conversation with. Until next time, this is Greg Amrafel, and you're listening to Pacific Time. Thanks again to our sponsor, Share It Music, who really embody the idea of community building. Your treat for staying to the end is the song Apology Tour from Share It band Instant Crush. Enjoy, and I'll see you soon.
1 time, 2 times, 3 times, we're done. I'm on a heartbreak hit and run. You say you wish I was more fun. When we're together, it's kinda whatever. Baby, I'm just teasing. You're crying for no reason. I know